G'day, fools. I'm Scott Phillips, the Motley Fool's Chief Investment Officer here in Australia, and welcome to one of our favourite YouTube series on our favourite investing books. We're kind of investing nerds here at the Motley Fool, as you might expect, and a lot of the good stuff comes from books, but often from places you wouldn't expect, and from books you wouldn't expect. In fact, the series is only relatively young, but some of the best, biggest, most well-known investment books we haven't even touched on, and we're not going to do that today either. Something different. Welcome, Ryan Newman. G'day, buddy. How are you?
Good, thank you, Scott. How are you, mate?
Mate, I'm excellent. And I've got to say, when I asked you guys for your favorite investing books, this is not one I would have expected in the top, 20, 25, 40. And yet, our very first one was Moneyball from Andrew Leggett, a very kind of important book and has some investing takeaways, but not considered an investing book. I would argue this one is not either. Now, The Tipping Point is by Malcolm Gladwell. I'll let you tell the story of the book. But I will say one of my favorite Malcolm Gladwell stories is the one of the pasta sauce. Have you been across that one?
No, I haven't. I'd be interested to hear it, though.
Very first time I saw Malcolm, this is a massive tangent, when I even started. Very first time I saw Malcolm Gladwell on video was a TED Talk. And he was talking about when, I can't remember which company it was, it might have been Campbell's in the US, want to come up with the perfect pasta sauce. They kind of said, well, try to work out how smooth it should be and how chunky it should be, and try to come up with the perfect amount of chunkiness and smoothness in a pasta sauce. Until they realized that the better idea was actually to have two separate pasta sauces, smooth and chunky. And it kind of makes obvious sense. And in hindsight, we kind of go, yeah, of course we know that. That makes sense. But it's one of those things where the average of two things isn't necessarily better than the two independently. And sometimes it's better to go separate than try and jam them together and come up with, what do they say, a camel's a horse designed by a committee. I imagine that might have been the case. It was kind of chunky, but not really chunky enough for the chunky people, not really smooth enough for the smooth people. It's worth understanding who your audience is and not trying to be a one-size-fits-all. So anyway, massive tangent, mate. Let's get into what you want to talk about. This is your segment, not mine. And this is about your favorite investment book. I've simply stolen the limelight here. The Tipping Point, mate, I'm not even sure. It's horrible confession. I'm not even sure I've read The Tipping Point. Can you tell? This is genuine, by the way. I'm going to hear your answer and then try and work out whether I actually have read it and just forgotten it. What is The Tipping Point about?
Yeah, look, it's got nothing to do with pasta sauce, I guess, straight off the bat.
There you go. Let's have to steal your thunder. That could have been terrible, right? If the whole book was about pasta sauce, it would have been a terrible video.
That's right, yeah. No, look, I think you mentioned an interesting point at the opening there that this wouldn't be amongst the typical investing books that you would find to be at the top of a list. I actually find that's generally the case for me. I actually enjoy reading about other topics that I can sort of apply to investing and sort of, that way of thinking. And I think The Tipping Point really helps with that as well. And the book really talks about three characteristics, and I'll list them and then sort of go into a little bit more detail on them.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah.
The first being contagiousness. Unfortunately, we know all too much about contagiousness these days.
Yeah.
The second is little causes can have big effects. Okay. And the third, which sort of ties those two or these three together, is change happens not gradually, but at one dramatic moment. So I'll go back to contagiousness, the first characteristic, for a second. So we're talking.
Before you do, mate. So I'm doing the whole tipping point idea. This is about change, right? This is about how things go from one state to another. Is that the broad idea? He's trying to just basically kind of break down why and how change happens. Is that kind of the top line?
Yeah, look, that's a pretty general approach to it. I would say. Okay. I think. Really, a better way to think about the tipping point, another word that a phrase that we use in investing often is the inflection point. And that's sort of, I guess, how we should be thinking about the tipping point. So we're sort of talking about contagiousness and how little causes can have big effects, that catalyst,
makes sense.
that inflection point. And I think what the book is really focused on, though, is this third characteristic, which is that change happens not gradually, but at one dramatic moment.
Hence the tipping point.
Hence the tipping point. And it's really what permits the greatest insight, I guess, into why modern change happens the way it does. And it's that dramatic moment. So you sort of got a flat line and then it sort of just curves upwards, that exponential growth.
Yeah, right.
And that, as humans, that's something that we really struggle to think about. We generally think more in linear terms rather than exponentiality. And we make rough approximation, I guess, between cause and effect. It's the reason we do that is it's simpler. It's a more efficient way to think. We can make very quick decisions on the go. We don't have to stop and think for 5 minutes to, really make sense of something. And as a result of that, it's really difficult to comprehend just how big some of these changes can actually be, because the effect seems to be so out of proportion to the cause itself. So to anyone who's heard me speak before, they're probably bored of this example, but I'll give it again anyway. Paper folding. If you were to fold a piece of paper in half 50 times, how? And I'm asking you this question, Scott. How tall would you expect it to be?
50 times, how tall would it be? A piece of paper. 5 centimeters.
Okay, 5 centimeters. Yep, not a bad guess. I look, most people would probably guess, maybe fridge height, ceiling height. That's actually way off. We're actually talking about 128 or thereabouts billion miles. We're talking three quarters of the way to the sun.
Yep. Fold a piece of paper in half 50 times.
Yeah. Now look.
Wow.
I'll I guess get to that is impossible to do. So that is impossible to do. You can't fold a piece of paper more than 7 times, I believe. But
thanks for being generous, by the way, and saying that my 5 centimeters wasn't a bad guess, given it was halfway to the moon. That was very generous.
Look, it was a reasonable guess in terms of how people think linearly, not in terms of actually being correct. So
right, okay. So what you're really saying is, you're like the rest of those knuckleheads. You're not very smart, Phillips. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, look, you look very silly at the minute, Scott. But we'll ignore that. So.
Yeah, thanks for giving me the setup. I could have actually been a little more smart if you told me in advance what you were going to ask me. Let's keep going.
Some prep time, yeah.
It would have been kind. Let's be honest. All right, tell me more about how silly I am.
So look, that's really, I guess, the premise of this book, that we as human beings struggle to comprehend that exponentiality. So little causes, folding a piece of paper literally 50 times sounds so easy, so simple, but the outcome is just so extreme. Right. Now, there's a whole lot of different things where we can talk about in terms of epidemics. It doesn't necessarily need to be an infectious disease, as we are so accustomed to. Can be in terms of trends such as clothing or dancing moves, thoughts, beliefs, ideologies, TV shows. You might be interested to hear that Sesame Street actually started out basically with the intention of becoming an epidemic. In the 1960s, they actually created it basically to an educational show, really running 5 days a week to teach children and give them a head start before they went to school. So yeah, epidemic can really take any shape or form. One more point from the book before I'll get into some takeaways I think that we have as investors. There are different ways that epidemics spread. And one of the ways I suppose that this book really tries to focus on is mavens, what we call mavens. And I believe that was actually a term created by Malcolm Gladwell, but basically mavens are information specialists. They're the people who we rely upon to connect us with new information. And I suppose that applies to us at the Motley Fool, right? So we actively search for the information and for the new investment ideas that we hope will, that we believe have the potential to become, multi-baggers over time. And we have done that with quite a few of our picks. Afterpay is one of the examples there. I'm not referring to us as mavens, but as an example, that is sort of what a maven would do. And I think that's a really interesting point. So I can get on to some takeaways for investors if you like.
Yeah, let's do that. So great book, worth reading for its own sake, do you reckon?
Yeah, it's look, I was actually sort of skimming through the book just last night, taking a couple of notes to obviously prepare for this, and I thought I really have to read this again. I thoroughly enjoyed the book. I actually find Malcolm Gladwell to be quite a entertaining and it's quite easy to read his books. And look, he is a writer as well. He used to write, or I think he still does actually write for the New Yorker. So he is quite accustomed to writing to people and writing in a very easy to understand and follow way. So I would say absolutely it's worth reading this book.
Awesome. All right, mate. So let's get to those takeaways. Obviously, good book's a good book anyway. It's worth reading for the sake of it. But this is, in theory, an investment book series. So let's assume there are some investing takeaways. What did you take away from the Tipping Point, mate? Or what could our viewers get from reading the book?
I don't mean to bring up COVID-19 too much in this talk, but I do think that in terms of a tipping point, I think it's quite applicable.
Yeah,
Uh,
unfortunately,
and,
it probably is.
and I think a key takeaway here for investors is that even after years of experience and exposure to exponentiality,
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
power of exponentiality and compounded growth is still so underappreciated. And one of the takeaways I had actually, this was actually recently, the 17th of August. So New Zealand shut down the entire country from one case on the 17th of August.
Yeah.
And it was really touted in the news by a lot of people as being completely ridiculous, a complete overreaction.
Mm.
By the 28th of August, though, they had 84 new daily cases even after that lockdown. And I think for me, it was after years of going through this and sort of learning more about lockdowns and how cases spread, that
Mm.
people are still touting that as ridiculous. Even after
Yeah.
the recent experience of obviously Sydney, unfortunately, people still find it hard to understand and comprehend. And I think as investors, we can learn from that, and we can actually see that there are still ways that we can actually think about investing in terms of this and actually benefiting from this trend. We can still find multi-bagger opportunities. And I guess we can do that by uncovering lots of rocks, identifying common misunderstandings, and then trying to exploit them.
That's a good point, mate. I'm struck by you make a really good point. There's so many examples of this. The easiest one is Amazon, and I own Amazon shares for the record.
Mm.
It's also almost a hackneyed example to your point of the same example being used over and over again. It's worth pulling out because people would have said in 1997 when Amazon launched, okay, maybe it can grow at 20% a year for 2 or 3 years. Okay, maybe it's 7 or 8 years. Okay, maybe it's 15 years, but at some point we've got to stop. And to your point, as investors, even as professional investors, the temptation to say, well, okay, can't keep growing at that rate after more than 3 years, or more than 5 years, certainly not more than 7 years, and definitely not more than 10 years. And yet here we are 25 years later after Amazon's launch, almost next year, and it's still doing 20% a year compound growth. And as you say, because even though the percentages are roughly the same year on year, 20-ish% growth year on year, it feels like a straight line, right? Because it's 20 plus 20 plus 20, except because on a higher base, it has that exponential component to it. Afterpay's uptake was the same sort of story. There, and again, even we can't say as investors, right? But I think maybe, as you said, picking Afterpay, plenty of other businesses besides, we've had to sort of suspend even the industry's own disbelief, right? There are very few investors or fund managers who can go to the boss and say, "Here's my model for Amazon. I think in 24 years' time, it's going to keep growing at 20%." I mean, you can make that case, and some people get away with it, but human nature is, well, of course it couldn't do that. It couldn't possibly be whatever big it is, $100 billion company or whatever it is in sales. Of course it couldn't possibly be that big because X. And yet here we are, and here it is. And I think that's the underestimation of the ability of something to continue to go in the same grow in the same quantum maybe actually is the biggest opportunity. Now, of course, there's plenty of pretenders to the throne, so it's not just a case of saying, well, anything can grow to the sky, therefore buy everything. But there is a real, as you say, that ability to compound for long periods of time does make a huge difference to returns if you can get in front of it.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think, I mean, I don't know of anyone who would have modeled Amazon like that back in the day.
Yeah.
People have owned it, obviously, for that long, a select few, but no one could have possibly thought, I think, that it would grow at this rate, compounded for so long.
Right.
So
it's also tempting to kind of jump out of that stuff at some point too, right? Of after it's had a few years of that, even if you had thought it at the time, Amazon goes from 9 to 100 and then to 1,000. At some point during that journey, you're like, I'm out, I'm done. I can't keep going clearly. And of course, it still does. There's again value in that. Maybe is the tipping point permanent, mate? Is there a case of do things go back, or is this literally a case of getting to that exponential curve stage? Is that the biggest lesson?
that's probably the biggest lesson. I think another lesson as well is that not everything can become an epidemic or
Yes.
reach that tipping point, so to speak. And that's actually another one of the lessons in the book is that the power of context. And I'll use Afterpay as an example here. Let's go back to the global financial crisis. What is that, 12, 13 years ago now? And that really instilled, I guess, a mistrust in credit cards and traditional credit among the millennials and now also Gen Z. Right. So that was really exemplified by the global financial crisis. Had that GFC not happened, I guess the question is, would Afterpay be so popular among those groups now? You know,
Great point.
because
Yeah.
I mean, in our world, we know it. We know that it is. But
Yeah.
the power of context. Had that not happened, maybe this epidemic of afterpay wouldn't have transpired. So there is that power of context, and I guess the book. It's been a while since I read the book. Actually, I do need to read it again, but it does go into detail, I guess, about how that context is really important to get right.
Nice.
And for investors as well, I guess another takeaway here is look for ideas that may not make a lot of sense historically. So looking back 15 years, you know, this, you know, what is now Afterpay, what is now would have been considered a non-traditional form of credit. You know, it wouldn't have made sense back then, but it does now when put into context. I'll throw in one more lesson as well. And this sort of, I guess, directly applies to Afterpay as well as Amazon as well, is don't sell your winners too early. I think from your traditional books, we're all taught buy low, sell high. I think another way to think about it is actually to buy low, buy higher. So you want to find winners. You want to keep on backing those companies that have the potential to keep on winning. Back the ones with optionality. Back the ones that have that potential to accelerate growth and to continue compounding year over year. At the same time, potentially look at selling your weeds, those that are underachieving and potentially actually dragging your portfolio lower.
I like it, mate. That's a great way to finish. That's certainly the sort of thing we try and do at the Motley Fool. Not always successfully. We have our share of losers as well. Maybe that's actually the point, though, as the cool kids say these days. Maybe that's a feature, not a bug, right? If we're trying to find the next Afterpay, the next Amazon, you can kind of afford to have a few losers. And frankly, you're going to have a few losers because some of them that we expect to be the next X don't pan out that way. Others do. And as you say, I think you probably almost have bought the entire S&P 500 and Amazon, and if the other 499 companies have gone badly, you'd probably still be okay given the phenomenal rise of Amazon. But it's a reminder that you have to some degree, play the odds of success of those exponential growers, knowing some will go badly because you expect that some will go well. And if they go particularly well, what's Afterpay? 2 to 140. Amazon's, 9 to 3,000. Those sort of winners don't come around that often, and they're not all that common. We're not saying by anything that grows. But that is a really great reminder, mate, that if you can find exponentiality and just simply back it in, more often than not, you'll be rewarded, I think.
Absolutely. And I have no doubt that after we're finished here, you're going to go and fold a piece of paper as many times as you can and see just how high that pile gets.
I will be halfway to the sun by morning, mate. I'll do my level best. I might need Elon to come pick me up in a SpaceX rocket. Ryan, thank you very much for sharing your favorite investing book, or one of your favorite investing books. I'm looking forward to the rest of this series. We've got heaps lined up. We originally were going to do one book each, and then the team went, well, I've got more than one. Can I do more than one? Like, yep, absolutely. So it went from my favorite investing book to our favorite investing books, plural. And so this series has got quite a lot to go. I'm looking forward to your next one, Ryan. I'm already wondering what it might be, but viewers, you'll have to stay tuned. Until then, until next time, Fool on.